He was the emperor who wanted nothing, and for that, Rome feared him most. In the quiet years after Augustus, when the empire still glowed with marble and pride, there stood a man who ruled all yet seemed haunted by the very act of ruling. His name was Tiberius Caesar, soldier, scholar, exile, and at last recluse. History remembers him as a monster, but monsters are rarely born. They are made, shaped by the weight of crowns and the silence that follows obedience. Tiberius was not the emperor Rome expected. Where Augustus had been charming, Tiberius was severe. Where others courted the Senate, he studied it with suspicion. He was a man built for solitude, the kind who understood people better when they were gone. His childhood was a theater of control. His mother, Livia, a master of manipulation. His stepfather, Augustus, a god in waiting. Between them, Tiberius was a pawn polished into marble. He learned that power was never a gift. It was a debt you could never repay. In his youth, Tiberius earned respect the Roman way, through conquest. He commanded legions across the Rhine, crushed rebellions, and brought order to restless provinces. Soldiers called him disciplined, even just, but never warm. He led not with charisma but with calculation. When victory came, he treated it as a duty, not a triumph. And in every triumph, he felt the eyes of Augustus upon him, measuring, judging, never satisfied. The truth is, Tiberius never wanted to be emperor. He wanted peace, but in Rome, peace was a threat. Ambition was the empire's oxygen, and Tiberius suffocated in it. His mother, Livia, knew how to use that weakness. With careful whispers, she pushed her son closer to the throne, removing every rival who might stand in his path. By the time Augustus died, there was no one left to oppose her son's rule. Tiberius ascended the throne in 14 CE, not as a conqueror returning home, but as a prisoner stepping into his cell. At first he ruled with restraint. Taxes were fair, laws stable, and Rome prospered. But underneath the calm, suspicion brewed. Senators plotted behind silk curtains, courtiers flattered with poisoned tongues, and Tiberius watched them all. The empire had grown too vast for trust, too proud for truth. The emperor began to retreat, not physically yet, but in spirit. He stopped attending the games, avoided the forum, and left messages instead of appearances. The people began to ask, was their emperor sick, or simply disgusted by them? The whispers reached his ears and they stung. For every insult there was a punishment, for every rumor an arrest. The old generals who once toasted his victories were exiled or executed under accusations of treason. The Senate, once a council of men, became a stage of actors, each line rehearsed, every applause mandatory. Rome became quieter but not safer. Fear has a way of keeping order long after justice has vanished. And yet, in private, Tiberius was not the beast they imagined. He read philosophy, wrote letters of melancholy precision, and asked astrologers not about his future but about his peace. He was a man terrified of legacy, of being remembered as another tyrant in a world that only remembers tyrants. But fear, once planted, grows wild. His mother's death unmoored him entirely. With Livia gone, no one remained to control him, and that, perhaps, was the greatest tragedy of all. By 26 CE, the emperor of Rome decided to vanish. Officially, he claimed to seek rest, to retire from the noise of politics. But those who knew him, or thought they did, whispered of darker reasons. He sailed south to the island of Capri, a rocky paradise in the blue bay of Naples, surrounded by cliffs that touched the clouds and waters that reflected nothing but sky. There he built his new world, 12 villas scattered across the island like shrines to solitude, each one named for a god. And at the heart of them all stood Villa Jovis, the house of Jupiter, his private fortress on the edge of the abyss. From Capri he ruled an empire he refused to see. Messages came and went, carried by trusted agents and feared guards. Every decree bore his seal but never his hand. The people began to forget his face, remembering only his shadow. The senators joked, quietly, that Rome was now governed by ghosts. They were not entirely wrong. Capri changed Tiberius. The sea gave him peace, but isolation sharpened his paranoia. He began to see betrayal in every report, conspiracy in every silence. Those he once trusted met mysterious ends. His right-hand man, Sejanus, powerful, loyal, and adored by the Senate, became the new face of Rome. For years, Sejanus ruled in his name, until ambition betrayed him too. When the emperor learned that Sejanus sought to claim the throne, his rage burned colder than fire. Orders came from Capri like thunder. Sejanus and his entire family were executed, their bodies displayed in the streets as a warning to all who dreamt too loudly. Rome trembled again. If Tiberius could destroy his closest ally from 100 miles away, who was safe? Capri became more than an island, it became a myth. Fishermen swore they saw torches moving along the cliffs at midnight. Sailors whispered that screams sometimes echoed over the waves. None dared land without permission, and those who did never spoke of what they saw. Yet in his solitude Tiberius grew fascinated by the sea. He would watch it for hours, motionless as if waiting for it to speak. Some said he believed the ocean could wash away his sins. Others thought he was already half gone, that the emperor who sat by the cliffs was a shell of the man who once commanded legions. The Monster of Capri they called him, but monsters are often born from silence, not sin. The sun rose each morning over Capri, turning the white stone of Villa Jovi's gold, and there the emperor sat, silent as the cliffs themselves. He spoke rarely now. Letters arrived, sealed in wax, trembling in the hands of messengers who had traveled for days. He read them in private, his eyes scanning the words as though each syllable might carry poison. He trusted no one. Even the sea, which once calmed him, now seemed to whisper secrets he could not bear. The few who served him on the island lived in a quiet dread. They said the emperor never slept. At night, he paced the corridors, his footsteps echoing through the marble halls, followed only by the faint rustle of the sea breeze. On certain nights, he would climb to the highest terrace and stare out at the black water below. Some claimed he saw ghosts there, the faces of those he had condemned rising with the waves to mock him. Tiberius began to test the loyalty of those around him. Small tests at first, a lie told by a servant, a secret whispered in confidence, and he would watch who repeated it. When the answer returned to him through another mouth, he would smile faintly, not in amusement but in confirmation. Each betrayal proved his belief that the world was built on deceit. He once wrote to the Senate that he was surrounded by a nation of slaves, and by then he meant every soul alive. He ordered the construction of hidden chambers beneath Villa Jovi's, storage rooms, libraries and tunnels leading to the cliffs. The island became a labyrinth of secrets. Sailors who brought supplies swore that guards led them through different routes each time, so none could memorize the path. There were rumors of rooms lit only by oil lamps, their walls painted with strange frescoes of gods and judgment. Tiberius had turned his villa into a reflection of his own mind, magnificent, guarded, and haunted. The old emperor's body began to fail, but his mind, twisted by solitude, refused to surrender. He studied astrology, seeking signs of his fate in the movement of the stars. He consulted philosophers but only to argue with them. He believed he had surpassed them all, that none understood the burden of being both man and God, the living embodiment of Rome's divinity. And perhaps he was right. There was no one left to remind him that he was mortal. As the years passed, tales from Capri reached Rome, and with each retelling they grew darker. Some said he held feasts that turned to cruelty, that those who displeased him vanished into the sea. Others whispered of young captives brought to the island, their fates unspeakable. It was impossible to separate truth from legend, but in Rome truth no longer mattered. The emperor had become a monster in the minds of his people. And yet, the strangest part of the story was how little he seemed to care. When reports of his reputation reached him, he simply laughed. Let them hate, he is said to have murmured, so long as they obey. It was not arrogance, it was exhaustion. Power had consumed him so completely that he no longer feared the loss of his name. The world could curse him if only it left him alone. One spring morning, a storm rolled across the bay. The wind howled through the villa's arches, tearing banners from the walls. Servants cowered in corners, whispering prayers. Tiberius stood by the window, watching the lightning strike the sea. He felt something move within him, not fear, not awe, but recognition. He had become what he most despised, a god that no longer believed in anything. Years earlier, he had built a small shrine at the edge of the cliffs. It faced the sea, with only a single statue, a likeness of Jupiter holding a bolt of lightning. Some said he prayed there. Others said he argued with the statue, demanding answers from the God who had given him everything and left him nothing. It was there, on certain nights, that screams were said to echo, or perhaps it was only the wind. In Rome the Senate lived in paralysis. No one dared act without the emperor's word, yet months passed between his decrees. Trials were delayed, taxes collected without guidance. The empire was on autopilot, governed by the shadow of a man who had turned his back on it. The senators sent letters pleading for his return, but none were answered. Capri had swallowed him whole. Then came the news that chilled even his most loyal supporters. His old friend and once trusted prefect, Sejanus, who had ruled in his name, had been exposed as a traitor. 4 years, Sejanus had plotted to seize the throne, manipulating the Senate, executing rivals, and securing alliances through fear. When word reached Capri, Tiberius reacted not with anger but with cold precision. He crafted a letter, measured and calm, and sent it to Rome. It began with praise for Sejanus, then shifted, line by line, into accusation. By the time the Senate finished reading it aloud, Sejanus was already dead. His statues were torn down, his family hunted. Tiberius' vengeance was absolute, and his message clear. He might be distant, but he still ruled. Yet the purge did not end with Sejanus. Dozens, then hundreds, were executed under vague charges of conspiracy. Rome drowned in fear and Capri grew quieter still. The emperor's paranoia had become the empire's law. As the years dragged on, even his guards began to change. New faces replaced the old, none lasting long. Some were promoted to serve him personally, then disappeared without a trace. Others returned to Rome, pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what they had seen. Capri had become a place where memory itself decayed. By now, Tiberius rarely appeared in daylight. He preferred the cool silence of night, walking alone through his gardens, the moonlight glinting off the marble statues that surrounded him. To an outsider it might have seemed beautiful. To those who knew the truth it was terrifying. The statues were not of gods but of men, senators, generals and courtiers long dead, their features carved from memory. He spoke to them as though they still lived, holding councils in the darkness where only stone replied. He was emperor of shadows now, ruler of an empire that existed only in his mind. And yet, somehow, his decrees still reached Rome. The empire still obeyed. Even from exile, his voice commanded the known world. Perhaps that was the greatest horror of all, that the most powerful man on earth no longer needed to be human to rule. The years on Capri stretched like a dream that refused to end. Time itself seemed to slow on the island, trapped between sun and sea. Messengers came and went, carrying orders no one dared to question. From his fortress above the waves, Tiberius watched the empire from afar, not through sight but through fear. His words still carried the weight of thunder, but his humanity had long since faded into the mist. No one knew exactly what life on the island had become. To those in Rome, Capri was a place of whispers, of strange feasts, of cruelty disguised as ceremony, of an emperor who had turned his exile into a kingdom of nightmares. The Senate spoke of him only in formal tones, pretending not to believe the stories, yet secretly terrified that they were true. Visitors to the island were few and fewer still returned. Sailors who delivered supplies described an unnatural silence that hung over the cliffs. The air, they said, felt heavy, as though the gods themselves had turned away. They spoke of strange lights flickering in the night, of screams that carried faintly over the water, and of guards who stared too long without blinking. It was as if Capri itself had absorbed the emperor's madness. Within the villa the world had narrowed to ritual. Tiberius followed a strict pattern, waking before dawn, reading reports from Rome, pacing the marble corridors until nightfall. He rarely ate in public and spoke even less. To those few attendants who saw him up close, he seemed ageless and ancient at once, his eyes sharp but his face drawn tight as parchment. He would stand for hours by the windows, watching the sea churn far below, as if searching for something hidden beneath its surface. Some believed he sought forgiveness. Others thought he waited for death. But Tiberius had grown used to disappointment. The gods, it seemed, had gone silent long before he did. The legends that survive from those years are both grotesque and fascinating. Fragments of rumor, half-truths born from fear. They tell of hidden caverns beneath Villa Jovis where the emperor tested the loyalty of his guests in cruel ways, of men cast from cliffs for the slightest insult, of chambers where indulgence turned to horror. The ancient historian Suetonius would later write of him with disgust, painting a portrait of a man consumed by every vice imaginable. Yet the truth may have been simpler. Tiberius was a man who had outlived every trust, every joy, and every reason to care. Even cruelty in his eyes was no longer evil, it was merely proof that he still had power. And so he wielded it like a blade against the emptiness. One evening, a violent storm approached from the west. The sea roared against the rocks, waves crashing so high they sent mist into the emperor's windows. A bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the cliffs in stark white. In that brief flash, Tiberius is said to have turned to his attendants and whispered, "Jupiter has come for me." Whether it was a confession or a challenge no one knew. The thunder answered for him. By then age had become his final enemy. His body weakened but his mind refused surrender. He no longer trusted physicians, believing that every drink could be poison, every herb a trap. He would order his food tasted 3 times, his water poured from sealed jars. The more he feared death, the closer it seemed to him. In Rome, power was shifting. His great-nephew Caligula had become a rising star, charming, young, adored by the people. Tiberius watched him carefully, testing him from afar. He invited Caligula to Capri, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps to shape him into his heir. What followed remains one of history's most chilling ironies. A dying emperor unknowingly passing his torch to a man who would burn brighter and madder than himself. Caligula arrived to find a ruler both terrifying and fragile. He played his role well, obedient, clever, patient. He laughed at the emperor's jokes, endured his questions, and studied his every gesture. Tiberius saw in him what he once had been, a boy molded by the empire's cruelty. Perhaps he pitied him, perhaps he saw his own reflection. Whatever the truth, the old emperor began to trust him, or at least to accept him as the inevitable successor. But others were not so patient. Among the courtiers, whispers grew that Tiberius' time was nearly over. The empire could not wait for a ghost to die. Plans were made quietly through coded letters and exchanged glances. The Praetorian commander, Macro, who had once served Tiberius faithfully, now looked toward Caligula with ambition. The empire hung between 2 generations, one fading, one waiting to erupt. In the spring of 37 CE, Tiberius fell ill. His breathing grew shallow, his skin pale. The physicians hovered helplessly, forbidden to act without his command. Days passed in silence. One morning they found him still, his eyes closed, his chest unmoving. The attendants bowed their heads, whispering that the emperor was dead. Word spread quickly across the island. Caligula was hailed as the new ruler. Bells rang in the harbor. The guards relaxed for the first time in years. But just as the celebrations began, a servant rushed from the chamber, trembling, pale, stammering that Tiberius had moved. The emperor, they said, had opened his eyes. He had sat up, gasping, reaching for his ring, the seal of power. For a moment the world froze. Caligula himself stood stunned, the crown not yet secured on his head. It was then, according to some accounts, that Macro gave the silent order. A blanket was thrown over the emperor's face, and the weight of empire pressed down until he stopped moving forever. No one dared speak of it again. When the sun rose over Capri the next morning, the sea was calm. The monster of Capri was gone, leaving behind a villa of silence and an empire that had learned too well the price of fear. His body was carried back to Rome, his ashes placed among those of emperors past. But his ghost, they said, never left the island. Fishermen claimed that on certain nights, when the moonlight hits the cliffs just right, they could still see a figure standing above the waves, silent, watching, waiting. In death, as in life, Tiberius remained what he had always been. A ruler trapped between divinity and despair, too powerful to be human, too human to be divine. And in the long memory of history, his name became both a warning and a mystery, proof that the greatest empire in the world could produce its own monsters, not from barbarism or greed but from loneliness. In the centuries that followed, the story of Emperor Tiberius blurred into legend. The chroniclers who despised him filled their pages with horrors, and those who feared him stayed silent. The truth vanished somewhere between those 2 silences. Was he truly a monster, or a man who looked too deeply into power and found nothing staring back? History, merciless as it is, does not forgive solitude. Calls it madness. They called him the Monster of Capri because it was easier than calling him human. Easier to believe that cruelty must be born from wickedness, not despair. But Tiberius had been both, conqueror and captive, emperor and exile, a man who sought to master the world and ended up trapped within his own mind. The island did not create his darkness, it only echoed it. The empire he ruled would continue without him. Caligula, the heir he had tested, would soon turn Rome into a spectacle of blood and theater, proof that the shadows of Capri had not died with its master. Power had simply changed its mask. And somewhere in that transformation lies the truth that haunted every throne ever built. Power is never content to be held, it must be survived. Even now, the ruins of Villa Jovi stand above the sea, wind carving through broken stone, waves whispering against the cliffs. Tourists walk its halls with cameras and curiosity, unaware that they are treading through the silence that once ruled an empire. There are no statues left of the emperor here, only fragments, foundations, the memory of footsteps that have long faded. Yet if you listen carefully, when the sea turns silver beneath the moon, you might almost hear the echo of a voice, a whisper carried through the centuries. Let them hate, so long as they obey. But the sea answers differently now. It speaks not in thunder but in patience. Empires fall, names fade, and even the monsters of history dissolve into dust. What remains is the question they leave behind, a question that Throne Unknown was born to ask. What truly creates a monster, the crown, the throne, or the loneliness that comes after both?